Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Good afternoon. Hi, Mike. Good to be here. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Chris Duffer, and I'm president of Center for Energy and Environment. And we would like to welcome you to our forum here today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day, especially on this beautiful spring day that we're having, to enjoy this with us. So I'd like to especially thank the McKnight Foundation. The McKnight Foundation, yes, let's hear applause. Thank you. So the McKnight Foundation has helped fund this forum here today and funds some of our policy work, and we really appreciate their support for this work. We're going to have a lot of experts up here on technology and on policy. They asked me to stick to the things I know best, so I want to call your attention to the drink ticket you'll find. If you flip this over, there's a ticket. That's a drink ticket for after the event. We'll magically turn the area outside into a bar. So please join us afterwards and chat for a little while. I'd love to do that. So have people been to how many people have been to a CEE forum before? Show of hands. Wow, that's a lot of people. So if you're familiar with how we've done this in the past, usually we have a technology forum, and then perhaps 5-6 months later, we switch to a policy forum. So this is the first time that we've actually tried to combine the two. So back at the office, when we're not holding forums, we try to make sure that technology is really at the forefront of what we do, that it's driving the work, that we understand what the data is saying, how things work in the field, and how things work in the marketplace. And that's what informs our programs, and that's what we hope, at least on our best days, informs our policy work as well. That's not always easy to do. But we thought that there was really not a better topic to do that sort of combination of policy and technology with than this issue of strategic electrification. Not just because it's a very hot issue and on a lot of people's minds, but it really does need to be informed by the technology. So we're very excited that we have pulled together a group of experts for you today. That we've pulled people from the national scene that we've gotten to know their work over the years and have a lot of respect for, so we really appreciate that they were able to make the trip out. And a lot of local folks, and I think you'll see a lot of familiar faces pop up on stage that you know. And speaking of that, if you are in the local energy field, you probably know our first speaker. In fact, if you're in the local energy field, he's probably had your job before. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Mr. Mike Bull, our Director of Policy.
Hey, everybody. I do often start these kinds of conversations with the idea that it's good to see everybody. I've probably worked with or for all of you over the years, and so you're quite familiar with my capabilities and my lack thereof. Which is, public speaking is one of those. And you can decide which side of the equation you want to put that on. You know, I was thinking about whether I should start off with this story or not, and I'm going to go ahead and start off. It has nothing to do with what comes next. so just so there's no nice segue to what comes next. So thinking about the events of yesterday and the FBI raid that you've probably all heard about, not on CEE, it was in New York, it wasn't us. It reminded me of the story. So I think most of you know that I worked for Governor Plenty as a senior advisor. Many of you know that I also, previous to that, was a nonpartisan legislative counsel to the House Regulated Industries Committee, which had jurisdiction over the utility regulation in the state at the Minnesota legislature. The chair of that committee, Lauren Jennings, had some serious issues with the feds, and ended up doing some time in a federal prison. Again, I had nothing to do with it. But he told me while he was under investigation that the FBI may want to come talk to me. And I'm like, sure, I don't know anything. I'm happy to sit down with them. But then I put it out of my mind because it was like, quite a few weeks before anything happened. My first day, my very first day in the governor's office, I'm sitting in my desk. Nobody knows me. I haven't even been through orientation. I haven't been, I'm not in the staff directory anyway. The receptionist at the front desk sets out an email that says, "Does anyone know Mike Bull? The FBI is here to talk to you." My heart fell through my stomach. I don't remember much about the rest of that day, but it was not a good day. So, but segueing, I don't think any of our speakers are under federal investigation, at least to my knowledge. But let's get on with the forum. Again, no easy way to segue from that to this, but thanks, Chris. It says right here, thanks, Chris. And thank you all for joining us today for what I think is going to be a really important conversation about electrification, both the technologies that we'll rely on and the policies that will help ensure that consumers benefit as we move in that direction. Chris, I think, covered who CEE is pretty well. We are a data-driven, community-based, and consumer-focused organization here in the Twin Cities with a passion for discovering and deploying those things, the most effective solutions for a healthy, low-carbon economy. That's what we do every day. I'm going to skip the next couple of slides because Chris talked about those. I want to give you some context for the conversations that will follow. Why do we think it's important to be talking about strategic electrification today? And well, here's why. Due to some forward thinking by Minnesota policymakers and terrific leadership from our electric utilities and advocates, Minnesota has made great progress in transitioning to a cleaner, more renewable supply mix. All of our major utilities, with Xcel leading the way, but also its Great River and Minnesota Power, Otter Tail Power, SIMPA, MRES, they're all retiring older fossil fuel generation and replacing those with wind and solar and high-efficiency natural gas, reducing carbon emissions from the Minnesota power sector by over 20% since 2005. However, despite this great work in the power sector, we're falling far short of our goals for the economy-wide. As you can see here, we've missed the 2015 milestone of 15% reductions by 2015, below 2005 levels by a significant margin, and we need a better strategy. There's a growing awareness that a pathway, and maybe the only practical pathway, to achieving Minnesota's deep decarbonization goals of at least 80% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2050 throughout the economy is through a combination of deep energy efficiency achievements, decarbonizing our electric supply, and then using that decarbonized supply throughout the economy when and where it makes sense to do so. And I want to explore those three elements with you briefly. For energy efficiency, you know that we've had a long history of energy efficiency in the state, and the cornerstone of our energy efficiency work is the Conservation Improvement Program. We estimate that Minnesotans have saved nearly $6 billion over the last 20 years, mostly through the power plants and other utility infrastructure that utilities haven't had to invest in, and so customers haven't had to pay for. CIP helps customers control their bills all over the state and supports 50,000 Minnesota jobs all over the state. And the national consulting organization, the Cadmus Group, recently found that CIP generates $4 in benefits for every dollar that we spend. It truly is, I think, Minnesota's most successful energy policy. In fact, since the addition of an energy efficiency resource standard to CIP in 2007, load growth for our electric utilities have begun to decline. That's a difficult thing for many of our utilities to be experiencing, but it's the benefit of that is, to put it another way, the load growth that we saw previous to 2007 is now being met largely through cost-effective energy efficiency, and consumers are benefiting greatly. It's a tremendous resource that delivers significant benefits to Minnesota consumers and has for many years. So why, though, is energy efficiency critical to meeting our greenhouse gas goals? I'm having some trouble up here. I don't know where to put stuff. So if deep decarbonization is akin to the Herculean effort to land a man on the moon in the 1960s, then efficiency helps by moving the moon closer to us. My kids hate this analogy, but I'm going to use it anyway. It does so by reducing the amount of infrastructure and other investments we need to make to decarbonize the economy, making these investments more affordable. It also helps us to postpone investment decisions, allowing cost and operational improvements in clean energy technologies to emerge, thereby also reducing the risk of poor decisions as we transition to that healthy, low-carbon economy I mentioned earlier. So as we maximize efficiency, the next step of the strategy is to continue to decarbonize the economy. We recently completed an analysis at CEE looking at the depreciation schedules, average lifespans, operating licenses for the large generation service units that serve Minnesota, and found that we have almost 7,000 megawatts of generation that are responsible for over 95% of Minnesota's 2015 power sector CO2 emissions, are retirable by 2040. That's a massive opportunity for us to nearly completely decarbonize our electric supply mix at the pace and scale that the climate science says that we need to. And then as we decarbonize our electric supply, we can use that electric supply in other parts of the economy, as I said, when and where it makes sense. It's no surprise that transportation is a significant source of carbon emissions and has recently surpassed the power sector as the largest source of CO2 emissions. But industrial buildings and processes, as well as residential commercial buildings, are also very substantial sources. We'll need to address all of these in some logical sequence to meet our deep decarbonization goals. So how do we know when it's strategic to deploy an electrification technology? We've been engaged in conversations with a number of utilities for the past 18 months, as well as a regulatory docket where we're trying to work through these issues. And here are the criteria that we're currently working with. We think that a deployment of the electric technology should reduce overall energy use on a fuel-neutral basis. It should reduce carbon emissions relative to the non-electric alternatives. It should improve grid operations and be managed or operated so as not to contribute to a utility system peak. And finally, it must save customers money. It's critical that our electrification strategy, as we develop it, be data-driven and avoid expensive and unproductive missteps along the way. So what are we talking about? Here are some primary types of electric technologies we'll be looking at to deploy over the coming years: air and ground source heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, electric cars and buses, among a plethora of others. We'll be hearing more about these technologies and others in our tech panel that'll be coming up soon. I'm almost done. Here are some of the important questions that I think I expect will be discussed today. Again, how do we know that deploying a particular technology is strategic, beneficial, or efficient, I think is another adjective that's being used? I shared our list, and I'm interested in what others think are the criteria. What's the role of natural gas in a decarbonizing economy? There's a massive amount of infrastructure in the ground right now that's delivering low-cost natural gas to Minnesotans for heating and other purposes. We'll be hearing about this from Rick Murphy, who's the Managing Director for Sustainable Growth at the American Gas Association, and they've been doing a lot of good work and good thinking about this. I don't imagine it's all that comfortable to be the gas guy at an electrification conference. I really appreciate Rick joining us and providing his insights. What role should utility regulators play? Minnesota has really strong policies for decarbonizing the electric supply. and broad policies for decarbonizing the economy. How do these policies interrelate with the more traditional regulatory requirements to provide safe, reliable, affordable utility services at just and reasonable rates? And we're lucky to have Commissioner Dan Lipschultz here to share his thoughts. How can efficiency and electrification policies coexist? If done wrong, these policies can pull in different directions, much like the push me, pull you animal from Dr. Dolittle, if any of you remember. It's kind of old, so now the millennials are looking at me like, Doctor who? Done well, though, these policies can pull together on the same end of the rope, accelerating decarbonization and mixing my metaphors. How will we make sure that we do it well? I'm sure our keynote speaker, Cheryl Carter of the Natural Resources Defense Council, and an Electric Power Research Council board member will touch on these subjects. Here are the wonderful speakers we've brought together for this conversation. Again, none of them, as I understand it, are under FBI investigation. I think it'll be a terrific event, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our experts. So, without further ado, I'd love to introduce my friend Cheryl Carter. Cheryl and I have known each other for almost 30 years now, since she and I and Nancy Lang, the chair of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, all went to grad school together. And to steal a quote, actually, from my friend Ed Garvey, I was in the half of the class that made it possible for Cheryl and Nancy to be in the upper half, thereby launching their careers. Following grad school, Cheryl worked here at CEE for a number of years before she left us to work for some rinky-dink outfit known as the Natural Resources Defense Council. Joking, but it is a powerhouse. And she's now the director of their power sector work. We're very glad she was able to join us here today. So please help me welcome Cheryl Carter. Clean up my mess.
Great.
Oh, it's right here.
Oh, yeah, that'd be good.
To make sure to turn it on.
There you go. There's a reason I'm not on the technology panel. So anyway, thank you very much, Mike, for that great introduction, and thank you, Chris and CEE and Mike McKnight Foundation for having me here. I have a little prop I'm going to get and try not to break. So when I first started working in the energy sector 20 some odd years ago, environmentalists were not particularly excited about electrification. In fact, we found ourselves opposing proposals for things like 200-watt light bulb, incandescent light bulb giveaways and all-electric homes. And we were doing this because electrification wasn't seen as the best way to improve our environment or improve public health. But we look at our energy use and our energy production overall and what we need to get from it, which is clean, efficient, and affordable ways to power our transportation, our buildings, and our industry, as well as bring down our carbon emissions. So we find ourselves supporting electrification now because it often is, and increasingly is, the best choice to meet all of these different goals. So what's changed? Well, one thing that hasn't changed is a 200-watt incandescent light bulb, and this is actually 300-watt, and I have no idea why it's clown size. Giveaway is still not going to fly, but the good news is, and my prop has been buried, we now have a bright 10-watt LED light bulb because of the energy efficiency programs and because of codes and standards that we've implemented. And so the things that have changed and made this all possible is electric technologies have gotten a lot more efficient. And the electric grid has gotten a lot cleaner. And as you can see, we're projecting it to continue getting even cleaner from there. So I'm going to be just kind of laying out the context of where we see electrification fitting in to our decarbonizing energy system, what some of that potential is, and then I'm going to leave you with several things that we're noodling on that I'm sure a lot of you are as well, and hopefully you can add to the list and maybe provide us with some answers, because we don't know all the answers. What we do know is that in order, we can go many different pathways to reach our carbon reduction goals, but energy efficiency, maximizing energy efficiency across the economy is going to be necessary no matter which pathway you take, and especially if we want to do it affordably. Electrification doesn't need to be in conflict with energy efficiency or reducing waste, and done right, it is energy efficiency, and it can broaden efficiency's reach. And it's unlikely that we're going to be able to electrify everything, but we're going to need to electrify a lot of things, and it's going to make a lot of sense to do so. In order to make all of this happen, we're going to need a much more robust and flexible electric grid. And we're also going to need very engaged utilities as partners to make this happen. And we're also going to need to leave some space for others to come in and contribute to the solutions. So Mike went through the basic building blocks of what it's going to take to decarbonize our electric system. And nearly every study that I've seen out there has these building blocks in them at different magnitudes. But we know we're going to have to maximize efficiency across the economy, decarbonize the electric grid primarily through renewables, but also other resources, and then decarbonize the direct fuel use in transportation, in buildings, and in industry. And there's two ways to make that happen, primarily. Electrifying vehicles, buildings, and whatever else we can, and also decarbonizing fuels, either through renewable fuels like biofuels, or through carbon capture and sequestration. NRDC did an analysis, our own pathways analysis, of how we think we can get to our 2050 80% reduction goals in carbon emissions. And the first three of these actually make up close to 90% of the reductions that we saw. And the last, decarbonizing fuels in buildings and transportation and industry, makes up a really important 10%. But there are a lot of different ways that these pathways can go. So this is, in a nutshell, what we found. We found in our study that energy demand, I don't know how easy it is for you to see the first top wedge there, but that's energy demand overall being reduced in 2050 by half. And about 40% of that is traditional energy efficiency programs, and about 10% is efficiency coming from electrification of different end uses. So you can see energy efficiency, traditional energy efficiency, is still incredibly important. The other piece of this that's really important is to make sure that we take advantage of the potential benefits of electrification, but also other distributed resources in increasing the flexibility of the electric grid so that we can incorporate more solar and more wind into the system itself. We all know that there's a lot of untapped potential for energy efficiency that we need to go after. And so the question often comes up, and Mike raised this, well, isn't electrification, which by its very nature, an increase in electricity use, counterproductive or conflicting with energy efficiency programs and thereby rendering them moot? We don't really need them anymore. And the answer is no, actually, it doesn't need to be. Done right, electrification is energy efficiency and can really broaden the reach of energy efficiency programs. In fact, electrification done right can be, the adoption of electrification can be facilitated through the same methods that we use for energy efficiency programs. But we need a way to compare the different end uses across the energy source. So for example, today when we look at water heaters, we look at what is the most efficient electric water heater, or we look at what is the most efficient gas water heater, and we're not looking at what's the most efficient way to heat water. Until we find a measure that can help us make that comparison across the different energy sources, we're not going to really fully tap the potential for energy efficiency. So one of the things that we found in our study is that electrification makes up about 45% of the US's energy needs. So today it's just 1/5, and these are national numbers, 1/5 of our energy use across the economy is electrified. So this is a more than double increase, but we've also found that total electricity use only increases 25% from 2015 levels. So you can see there's a lot of efficiency embedded in there. You're going to sense a theme here. And these are just, the numbers here are 70% of vehicles are electrified, passenger vehicles are electrified in 2050. The space heating numbers, the residential is the first number, commercial is the second for space heating, water heating. And the last piece is more than 40% of our industrial processes and industrial boilers are electrified. It's really difficult to find ways to electrify industrial processes. But not everything, as you can see, not everything is electrified. And as I mentioned, there are two different pathways to decarbonize direct fuel use in transportation, in buildings, and in industry. One is electrification, which is what our focus is today, but the other is sustainable renewable fuels like biofuels, as well as carbon capture and sequestration. There are a lot of noodles, as I call them, questions that we need to figure out, and it's unclear what the real potential for electrification is. We think we can do 45%. The Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI, just announced or just released a national assessment for electrification last week that actually came up with 40% of the economy in their transformational scenario electrified in terms of our total economy-wide energy use. And at the same time, a significant drop in overall energy use across the economy and a decrease in emissions. So in that, several of the studies that we've seen out there are fairly consistent, although the numbers vary a little bit. But we don't really know what the real answer is here. Right now, this is what looks like is the most feasible. And what NRDC did when we were looking at this is we looked at the pros and the cons. We looked at the challenges, because both of those pathways, electrification and renewable fuels, face a lot of challenges as well as opportunities. And what we found, and this is something that I'm hoping that we can discuss more, is that the electrification pathway really seems the most viable and scalable of the two. When we looked at renewable gas, we were using DOE's estimated numbers, which are still not that great. It's not, so far, nobody's figured out a way to scale it to really meet the bulk of our needs in 2050 in terms of carbon reduction. And we, of course, being NRDC, added our sustainability requirements to that, which dropped that number by half. So these are important considerations when we're moving forward and figuring out how we exploit these different pathways to get our carbon reduction targets in the most affordable way. So in our analysis, we actually used that limited valuable resource of sustainable biofuels and put them into uses that weren't easily electrified, like aviation, like long haul, heavy goods trucking, those kinds of things. And we ended up with the buildings and with transportation being heavily electrified. So does anybody know what today's carbon emissions are for residential and commercial buildings as a percent of our total carbon emissions? Anybody have a guess?
12.
Really close, 11%, and it might be 12% with the most recent numbers. So I often hear that, well, you know, that's not really, it's kind of a drop in the bucket, it's not really that important to address this now. We can kind of wait and we'll address the larger sources better. And we took a look at this, and we saw that this is a comparison of today's emissions for commercial and residential buildings from direct fuel use like petroleum, fuel oil and natural gas, and our total carbon budget for the whole economy in 2050. It's 54%. So it's obvious that we can't get there without addressing this use. And so it's on our plate of things to address. And I know it's on CEE's plate as well. So I like this graph because even though it's a little bit complicated, what you have here is this is focusing on water heating because that's something that we know a fair amount about already. And it's looking at electric resistance water heaters, electric heat pumps, and it's comparing it to two different gas water heating uses. And what you can see what happens, the bottom axis there is the percent of electricity production made up with renewables. So as renewables increase, this is what happens to the emissions per heated unit of water, which is what we need to get to. We're looking at how do we most efficiently and cleanly heat water in this example. And you can see what happens over time and where the different uses are. And think about what we need to do by 2030 and by 2050. This, for us, was really informative. Okay. So this isn't going to happen by itself. And even though there are over 100 different models, Energy Star models out there on the market today, they face a lot of barriers and a lot of challenges. So the things that we're really focusing on to help move this sector along is first leveling the playing field. Right now, a lot of the utility programs out there, energy efficiency programs, codes and standards, actually aren't energy source or fuel source neutral. They bias in one way or the other. So as I said before, we need to find a way to be able to compare across the energy sources for any particular use. So we're working on making sure that we come up with energy source neutral measurements and cost tests for these different technologies. Also, we need to make sure that we value the grid services. You hear a lot about what the potential is for, I'll talk about electric vehicles in just a second, but electric vehicles or heat pump water heaters, et cetera, the storage potential there. NRDC actually did a study with NRECA and also Great River Energy, and I think there might be somebody from Great River Energy in the audience, that showed that there's tremendous potential for electric water heaters to provide storage benefits to the grid. And we need to make sure that the policies that we put in place actually work on tapping that and exploits that benefit. And finally, we need a lot more research and development in this area and demonstration. We need to bring the costs down as well. So transportation, electric transportation. That's usually where everybody starts because it's a huge set of emissions and it's got huge potential for electrification. Does anybody know what the most effective and the biggest carbon reduction measure is for transportation in general? Those are good answers. Efficiency. So, and which includes reducing consumption as well. So this graph is a little bit busy. Well, at least it has a lot of wedges, which is a good thing. And the top triangle, the 28 gigatons, are the policies that have already been adopted and are in process. So those are the reductions that we expect from the things that we already have in place. They're going to be playing out over time. Unfortunately, that red wedge right there is what the current federal administration has put under review again Hopefully we can maintain that, that wedge, because that's a big chunk. And then the second set of wedges are the opportunities, the potential for further reductions and where those lie. And what you see is in the progress wedge, the only thing that's not efficiency is that purple slice. And on the opportunities, the only thing that isn't efficiency are the light blue and the pink down at the bottom slice. So efficiency, again, is our most important carbon reduction measure. But this gives you an idea of where we came out to reduce emissions in this sector, and this is more than just passenger vehicles, this is all transportation. This is heavy duty and light duty to get our 80% emission reductions. So, like I said at the outset, the grid is going to be even more important than it has been up until this point. And utilities are going to be really important players in making all of this happen and facilitating adoption of these technologies. So NRDC put out, I guess what you could call a blueprint of how to most effectively do an electric vehicle program, utility program for electric vehicles, and what the utility's role can be and what the commission's role can be. And these are just some of the highlights from that. We've got it on our website. It's a pretty detailed report, and we also have a very short brief that outlines these different pieces. But basically, this is the work that we're doing across regions in the US with utilities and with commissions to try and get these programs in place. A lot of the barriers, the biggest barrier probably for electric vehicles is charging infrastructure. But there are also a number of things that need to happen in order to make a successful program. The first is regulatory certainty and certainty in what the utility's role is in helping to facilitate these programs, as well as making sure that these resources, electric vehicles is what's being talked about in this slide, but this also goes for the building technologies, are incorporated into the utilities planning, and those benefits are incorporated into the planning as well, because that's important not only for the operation of the distribution system, but also the transmission system, and that will help enable integration of more wind and solar. Again, increasing the amount of renewables that we can actually get onto the grid. The next thing we need to do is remove the barriers to customer adoption. This is awareness and of what the benefits and the opportunities are for customers is really important here. And ensuring grid reliability. This means making sure that there's smart charging and programs, time of use programs that make sure that people charge during the off-peak times when it actually helps the grid and doesn't hurt the grid. As I mentioned, closing the charging infrastructure gap is one of the biggest challenges that we have, and utilities can really help to facilitate adoption of charging infrastructure. Whether it's under an ownership model or a non-ownership model and just a facilitation role or a hybrid, we're seeing all of those models being adopted across the country, but one thing is constant in there, the utilities have a role in helping make this happen, and it's good for the customers. The other piece of this is promoting equity. So it's going to be important to make sure that this infrastructure is available and these technologies are available in disadvantaged communities. This has a double benefit. It increases the number of charging customers, but it also directly impacts, the disadvantaged communities are often the places where they have the worst air quality, local air quality. And one thing that should also be incorporated in addition to just passenger vehicle electrification, is looking at medium and heavy duty short haul trucking, because this can also help reduce the diesel emissions in these communities and reduce the public health impacts as well. And finally, making sure that we capture the value of the grid services that are provided by these electric vehicles. that was, there are a lot of questions. There's a lot we don't know about how this transition is going to take place and how we can make this happen, and things that we need to answer. And I call them noodles. These are the things that we're thinking about right now. But I'm sure you have others to add to the list, and maybe some of you even have some answers to some of these, but we're going to need to figure all these out together. So how do we efficiently value and capture the grid services and the flexibility provided by these technologies so that we can increase the amount of renewables that we have on our electricity grid? This is one of the biggest selling points of these technologies has been it's going to help the grid. How do we make sure that this actually happens and we value this? How do we compare across all the alternatives and make sure we get truly the most efficient technology choice for a particular use? The age-old question of who benefits and who pays, but more importantly, what is the utility's role in this? We need to be clear about what that role is so that they can really help facilitate this market and so others can enter it. And some really tough questions for our future panelists here. How can we and when do we have to choose between electrification and gas? And what are the air quality benefits, both long-term and short-term for that? You might come up with different answers if you're just looking at 2030 versus looking at 2050. And what happens to the infrastructure that we already have in place? And what do we do to avoid unnecessary investment in long-term infrastructure that could be stranded down the line in this transition? These are all really important things to noodle on. But again, some of the things that we do know and that are consistent across all of the different analysis and work that I've seen is no matter what pathway we take, we're going to need to maximize efficiency across the economy. That's really the only affordable way to get this done. And electrification, if we do it right, and we have to do it right, is energy efficiency. So we need to look at that. But we're not going to be able to electrify everything. It's unclear how much we're going to be able to electrify. We say in our analysis 45%, EPRI says 47%. A lot of folks are somewhere around that range, but others say electrify everything. What is the real answer? I think some of that we can figure out on the way. But we need to have the right metrics and we need to have the right measures in place to make sure that that happens. And finally, the grid is going to become the electric grid is going to become even more important than it ever has been in order to make all of this happen. And that means that the utilities are incredibly important partners in helping to facilitate this transition as well. And in case you didn't get it before, efficiency first. So I guess I want to leave you with one takeaway. It would be that we're going to need efficiency no matter what, and electrification and the cleaner grid doesn't mean we're not going to need efficiency or it's less important than it was before. Thank you.
Mike, you really know how to set a low bar. We don't have to be under a federal investigation to be up on stage. I feel good. I said that. So I'm Megan Hoy, the engagement manager at CEE in the education and planning and engagement department. And I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce our three speakers today that are going to help us continue to focus on the technology portion of this forum. As Chris and then Mike both stated, we're an organization that really does focus on technology and the technical aspects that really drive what we're thinking and our strategies that we try to move forward. And I don't think that any of us can argue that the technology is sort of the foundation of what allows us to move forward in the world of electrification. So to help us stay grounded in that and grounded in that for the next hour and a half or so, we have with us today three speakers. And I'm just going to kind of do quick introductions so that they can say a little bit about themselves before they speak directly. So we have with us Ashley Horvath. She's the Vice President of Public and Private Partnership with Green Lots. They're an electric vehicle service equipment company. We have with us Ben Schoenbauer, who's a Senior Research Engineer with the Center for Energy and Environment and my colleague. And we also have Kate Doshers. Okay, I meant to check with you. I apologize. So she's a Senior Analyst with the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, or VEIC. Thrilled to have all of you with us, and so that they'll be going back to back. I will invite up Ashley right away. Thanks so much. Just do that.
Hello, everybody. I came last night to Minneapolis from Seattle. So I'm happy to be here, and I have a few family members that I've always wanted to visit here, and I was excited to meet with them. They're chefs in this city, so they introduced me to some good food this morning. So yeah, good low bar to set with being under federal investigation. Yeah, batten down the hatches, like all my electric vehicle binders, I need to make sure they're all ready to go. But anyways, so I work at Green Lots. We're an electric vehicle charging technology company. I've been in the electric vehicle industry for almost a decade, kind of around the time of the Stimulus Act, when that was passed, the ARA Act in 2009, which I'm sure the majority of you are fairly familiar with. So that really stimulated the industry. Talking about technology and policy and all of these things in sort of a separate bucket is difficult for me, because really I got my start in the electric vehicle industry not really intending to get into the auto industry per se. I started off on the environmental track, studying environmental policy and political science, and thought one day I'd be studying whales like I started out doing, and I went from that to transportation, and as soon as I kind of got into that, it was like a vortex, and I was forever sucked into this vortex, because I believe that electrification is really like the confluence of renewable energy and technology and policy, and you can really feel the impact. In fact, you can make one decision as far as purchasing an electric vehicle, and you've already made an impact not just on the broader movement, but also in your own neighborhood. You know, you can really feel that the air is cleaner. You know, as soon as you're driving behind a diesel truck that's emitting a lot of fumes, and then you're in an EV, you suddenly feel like you're on this pedestal. So we got to make sure we keep ourselves pretty humble with that. But it's nice to breathe clean air, right? So try to move through this pretty quickly. So kind of just a little bit about myself. So I started out in the public sector, was in the public sector for just over 5 years for the state of Oregon, and found myself in DOE and DOT. But I worked for Governor Kitzhaber, so very much so on the regulatory policy end of things, but also on the technology shaping, because I was housed within an innovative partnerships group that was looking at ways to try to stimulate technology in industries, but from the standpoint of not encumbering an industry and not necessarily trying to project too far ahead. So we projected out about 5 years. And what we did was we decided that it was necessary at the time in 2010 to really apply for grant funding to develop long-distance fast charge corridors. In many ways, we were kind of ahead of our time in the sense that people were constantly arguing that this was too soon. CHAdeMO standard for fast charging was not enabled, UL listed, however you want to phrase it. But there was the Leaf and there was the Volt. In December 2010, those were released. We decided that it was an imperative for Oregonians to purchase EVs to have this backbone infrastructure. So we set out to deploy the West Coast Electric Highway fast chargers every 30 minutes to 50 miles outside of the city. So that was another step in our decision making, and I'm sure this is probably near and dear to Minnesotans. We didn't just want it to be Portland or Salem, because I feel like then it becomes a dismissive technology. Well, that works for Portland people because, you know, they're Birkenstock Highway. But once you actually start getting out into, and by the way, I'm from Michigan and Ohio, so I have Midwest blood in me. I went to school in Michigan and lived in Ohio. So I understand that practical bent and the affordability and actual practicalness of the driving experience. So we wanted to make sure that we went out into the rural areas. And then this was finalized in 2015. We created the Oregon Electric Byways, and then I went on to help launch Electric Highway in California. Partnered with tourism industry on the plug in Pinot. We worked with electricians, IBEW, and then I found myself as the ZEV regulatory head for Oregon, along with Mary Nichols, who's been in the news lately, fighting battles on Twitter. And us women were all vertically challenged, but we went out there and declared that there would be 3.3 million EVs across the northeastern states and California. All of those states regulate and mandate the purchase of or the sale of electric vehicles. So a little bit about green lots. So we operate kind of at that nexus of transportation and energy. We actually don't manufacture the equipment. We have the software, and we partner with the majority of the EVSE companies, electric vehicle supply equipment companies. But our main sort of core belief is in open standards. So been around since 2009, but be aware that you've seen companies come and go, large companies, small companies, and it's absolutely critical to have that flexibility to not only switch the network if green lots isn't working for you, but also to be able to switch the equipment. And so as a utility, you're looking at assets distributed across a wide range of geographies and needs, and so it's imperative to have that software that can integrate that, do load management, ancillary services, that kind of a thing. So our platform allows us to have these flexible pricing options, and that's the pathway that we've found ourselves on. But we also do customizable programs. So we can do the turnkey solution. We prefer to do just the software, but we're able to do any of it, and we've done that for many different companies. Just a little bit more about how OCPP works. That's the main open charge protocol standard that most companies adhere to. And so we work with anybody from Siemens to ABB, FSEC, major companies. We also work with EV Box and others in this space. I'm going to skip over this one. Actually, I thought I hid that one. So all of that lends itself really well to not only working with utilities, but we also work with cities. So the city of LA, Mayor Eric Garcetti made it a really big imperative across the different departments that they wanted to create a really strong portfolio of electric vehicle programs. So we have a contract with LA, and we work with all of their different departments. We work with LADWP, we work with the LAPD on their fleet infrastructure, and bring all of that together under one umbrella so the city and the utilities have a wide, expansive view into how do they monitor, how do they control. It wasn't talked about in the initial presentation, but it's not only like how do we predict out technology and policy, but how do we account for things that are only beginning technology-wise? So like Uber and Lyft, how have they shifted transportation? And then the next step is autonomous vehicles. Are we putting this infrastructure in places that make sense, not just for people who are typically using the vehicles, but when ownership is less and less of a reality? So those are kind of the key benefits. I'll just give a real quick tidbit. Sorry, I'm trying to not talk too fast where you can understand me, but also give you a ton of information so you walk away happy. So this picture is an officer with LAPD. So there's one building essentially where they needed all of their chargers, 100 different chargers to accommodate their BMW i3s, which are 100% electric. However, the building could not accommodate that load if every single EV were to pull in and charge at the same time. Can't happen. So the way that we're able to do that is to manage that through our software. So the officers and non-essential, this is not chase vehicles or anything like that, but they still need to maximize and have efficiency with their own time, right? So they plug in, they don't see any of that. That's all kind of behind closed doors. We manage that. We can manage the building load, all of that, so that it's based on the state of charge of the vehicle. We also have a long-standing relationship with BC Hydro, seamless user experience, fast charging corridor, open standard, load management, all of those things. I'm going to skip over this other case study so I can get to the behemoth in the room, Electrify America. So one of the biggest things that I talk about, and this probably is going to make Electrify America or Volkswagen happy, but they know I'm very upfront. We can't count on automakers making poor decisions, right? And getting penalized. You know, they call it an investment, but essentially the reason for it is because they did, start out with this behavior. So now we get this great benefit of a lot of charging stations. Well, the problem is when you talk about filling in gaps and all of those strategic electrification strategies, when you see these types of numbers and investment, you automatically think, well, great, that's solved, we're done, no more needed. And cities are trying to figure out how to augment that existing network. This is just the beginning. It's just the beginning, but the investment in the electrical conduit, all of those interactions with host sites takes time. So while this is an investment to spur the industry, this is just laying the groundwork. there may be stranded assets, but there will always be that electrical infrastructure that was invested, and also the time with the host site, which, believe it or not, takes the longest amount of time. On average, it took me 6 months to get a host site to sign on the dotted line, and we were successful in some instances, but even when it's free. So it's that constant building of community, building of knowledge, awareness, getting that understanding of electric vehicles, getting that exposure. So when you see this, I'm sure if you're in the utility world, you're thinking of, okay, how many utilities are in this? Just to give you a little bit of an example, in Oregon, we had the initial 22 locations. We had 16 utilities. We had some PUDs, some IOUs. It really ran the gamut. Some of the things that we encountered were demand charge issues. So our private partner was getting really hefty bills for the actual cost to refuel when the customers weren't feeling that. So how do we communicate the cost of electricity to, you have this great advanced technology, but how do you sort of like rein in the nerd, is what I call it, to give enough information to where people are interested, but not too much to where they're like, oh, this is too complicated. So I think it's really important to create that outreach and education, but people are pretty divorced from how much electricity costs. Plugging in a gas vehicle is a lot more interactive, so this re-interacting with the electric grid, and you plug in your phone and that kind of a thing, but this is a pretty essential piece of equipment for you to get from point A to point B, so it's kind of re-engaging it and get people aware of electricity and the value for that, and so I think it's a great opportunity, but also a challenge. But I think technology, anytime you can integrate technology seamlessly into what we're already doing, so like Uber and Lyft have done that with our phones, and sort of suddenly you wake up one day and you're relying on something that didn't exist 3 years ago. I think if we can kind of get to that with electrification, and my answer to the strategic electrification question as far as how do we know when to get involved, I think yesterday. Even if you make a decision today, and we've done that where they were difficult and maybe we could have done it better and we could have planned for it, the technology is just changing so quickly that policymakers aren't even able to keep up, even when you're trying to stimulate the market. So I would encourage concurrent pathways to be able to make mistakes and to learn from that in the future, but also at some point you just kind of have to get something done and get it in the ground, and the technology will progress. We will see assets that are stranded, but we're seeing more and more that this is building out a network and an awareness. And that's what we're trying to create with the Green Lots platform. So I'm committed to it. I'm not going anywhere. I think that this industry is going places, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And thanks again to McKnight Foundation and everybody that dedicated the time for today. So thank you.
Going. All right, I'm Ben Schambauer with the Center for Energy and Environment. As Megan mentioned, I'm a senior research engineer at CEE. I've been there for just over 10 years now. And they asked me to come today to talk a little bit about one of the technologies we've been doing research on, cold climate air source heat pumps. So this is sort of that, as Mike and Chris referred to earlier, that data-driven approach that CEE tries to go with. This is one of those projects where we got out in the field and did a bunch of work. So we've been looking at heat pumps for about 3 years, and they asked me to put that into about 10 minutes worth of talk, so we'll see how that goes. So if you aren't familiar with air source heat pumps, just a couple minutes here. Essentially in the summer, it's a split system air conditioner, basically the same exact system, compressor-based system that moves heat from inside your house to the outside, meeting your set point in your home, keeping your house nice and cool. The difference with heat pumps is that that system can run in the opposite direction in the winter and provide heat to your home. Traditional systems that sort of started in the south, kind of capped out around 30 degrees outside. At 30 degrees, they could move heat and heat the house, but anything colder than that, they struggled. In the last sort of few years, this new generation of heat pumps has come out, and it started to push. Manufacturers are claiming -13. We've seen some systems running even down to -20, -25 outside. They're moving heat into the home, which is a pretty incredible engineering feat that they can actually do that. And so as this technology comes out and becomes more mature, it represents a really great opportunity in cold climates that hasn't been available in the past. And so we saw this opportunity, especially with about 40% of Minnesota that's on either delivered fuels or electricity as their primary source of heating, where they don't really have a lot of options for energy efficiency or cost reductions in their heating systems. And so we saw this as an opportunity. We submitted a proposal to and received a CARD grant and also some additional funding from GRE and EPRI and McKnight to look at these systems, and we really started this deep research project. And these are the couple of technologies, just to show you if you're unfamiliar, what they look like. We kind of focused on these two systems, the first being a kind of whole house option that looks very similar to your standard furnace and air conditioner system. So as I mentioned, these things do heat down to -13, -20, but their performance starts to diminish as you get to those really cold temperatures. So typically they come with some sort of backup, and in this case, a LP furnace. We also have the ductless systems over here, very much the same on the outside, but on the inside of the house, you just have sort of a point source system that head inside the room that's got your fan and your coils and everything all in that little package. So our project, we actually installed 6 systems. We tried to get a representation of Minnesota. As far north as Lutsen, and sort of some in the metro and west of the state, just to really get a good representation of the state. And with that install, we also put in a ton of monitoring equipment, so we could really get that data to help us determine how these systems were actually working and make sound decisions moving forward. And right off the bat, it became evident that the install was going to be very important. I mentioned this technology has been around for a long time, but there's been this recent advancement. So people weren't really sure how to handle this new generation of equipment, and they were used to standard practices from the older generation. And so we found sort of some things in each of these areas that we really needed to think about as we were starting up this project. I'm going to focus on a couple of them. There's a lot of information on this slide, but the main thing I want to point out is that it's really important to match this new system and its capacity with what the need is for the home. And we're thinking about it in a little different way because we're actually thinking about this system as a heating system now. And so you can see on this chart is that sort of how that performance of that system, it can deliver less fuel. It's harder and harder to transfer heat as it gets colder out. And so you need to sort of decide what size system you want to use. It's totally capable of providing all the heat needed to the house, but you end up with this huge heat pump. And so you want to balance the needs between, sort of meeting all the heating load with putting in a reasonable piece of equipment. And so we found the sort of typical rule of thumb was that if you were going to install the system for cooling, so if your house needed like a 3-ton air conditioner, you'd probably want to go with about a 4-ton heat pump. And that would meet about 80% of the heating load in Minnesota. And so, if it can do 80% of the heating load in Minnesota, that's a pretty impressive piece of equipment, sort of thinking about the nation as a whole. Then on the other side of things, with the ductless systems, so this is sort of a floor plan of a house, and you can see the red here is sort of your typical electric resistance heaters or like a hydronic baseboard, something like that, and you sort of have those systems distributed throughout the house. Well, now you've got that one kind of point source heating that indoor head, and so you want to put it somewhere where you're going to get the most benefit out of it. And so for this install, we sort of picked a center of the house application where you can really deliver heat to all those main rooms. And so you can think about different floor plans and how some houses with more open floor plans might look better than others. And so that was a really important piece that people weren't necessarily used to thinking about when they're thinking about a heating system. So I mentioned that really detailed data. So this is kind of a one-slide summary of 3 years worth of data, and it's kind of system performances compared to their baseline. So we're kind of comparing to the simplest baseline systems here, an electric resistance system that has about a 1.0 or 100% efficiency throughout the year. A furnace, condensing and non-condensing, that are somewhere between 80 and 95% efficiency. But then you can see these heat pumps, these 2 lines at the top here, that are sort of comparable in the coldest times of year, but really more and more efficient as the temperatures warm up. And so you can get some really impressive annual efficiencies. And so with our flex fuel propane system, we saw annual efficiencies or COPs of about 1.3 and about 2 for the ductless systems compared to your 1 or 0.8, 0.9 for your baseline systems. The other thing I should point out on these slides is that we're just comparing to, as I mentioned, the simplest systems. There's a wide range of gas and electric systems out there, and advancements in those technologies as well that we weren't really considering, but we were really focusing on the simple baselines. So I mentioned McKnight also provided some support for this work, and this is a representation of that work and where we're going with that. And this is an application that we're working on to look at sort of how the emissions are changing based on these sort of real world data that we've collected and where heat pumps are at versus those baseline conditions. And so this is sort of predicting the grid forward, and mostly what this plot is looking at is sort of how the grid is changing with what's planned currently from utilities in terms of coal retirements and the like. And what you're seeing here, I won't get into all the details, but as of about 2015, the heat pump system in comparison to that propane system became beneficial from an emissions standpoint. So it's the heat pump using less emissions on an annual basis than that propane, all propane system. And as of about 2023, under this model, it looks like the same will be true for a natural gas-based system with a gas backup. And so that sort of gives you an idea of how efficient and how efficiently operating those heat pump systems are. In terms of kind of overall big picture performance, we compared those ducted heat pumps, like I said, to the condensing propane furnace, and we saw that annual efficiency of about 130%. Our site energy reductions were about 40% compared to a standard condensing furnace. So it's some really big site reductions. We got the cost reduction to the homeowner by about 30%, and kind of that 5% emissions reductions. So if you think back to that, those sort of what we mean when we think of strategic or beneficial electrification that Mike talked about, we're starting to check off quite a few of those boxes when we're looking at heat pumps, especially compared to propane furnaces. And I mentioned about the emissions, sort of how the future might look for natural gas as well. The other thing I want to point out for these customers that were on propane, and especially a few years ago when there were some big propane shortages in the state, there's some pretty costly propane costs in the summer that we don't have a lot of control over. Well, these systems reduced the propane usage by about 60% in those homes, and so that was a big benefit to those homeowners. From the all-electric side, the ductless heat pumps, we saw that additional boost in performance as well, up to about 2 COP of 2, which is about a 55% reduction kind of over the baseline of performance. And the last kind of thing I want to point out in terms of takeaways is that this heat pump technology has been around for a long time, like I mentioned, and the equipment is all the same in today's systems. And so basically anyone that knows how to install an air conditioner or a heat pump is ready to go on these systems. They can put this system in. They will need a little bit of training on how to set the systems up and make sure they run right, but they're sort of ready for deployment, and the technology is sort of pretty well matured, and manufacturers kind of across the board have it figured out. They're capable of meeting our loads. Like I mentioned, they do need some backup in a lot of cases, but they're working as they describe and as they say. And then the last thing I want to say is just in general, these should be seriously considered kind of right now, especially for propane. Like we mentioned, the metrics are all sort of kind of in line. But even on the gas side, while the full system might not be emissions positive right now, there are times of the year when heat pumps are running really well. They have that really high efficiency of almost 300% in the shoulder seasons, and you can get some really, really good performance. And then I'll stick in a plug there for our website at the end. We've got a full report on this project out now, so if you want about 200 pages worth of info, you can get it right there. So with that, thanks everyone.
Okay, I think I got everything set. So my name is Kate Dureshi. I'm here from Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. and I'm here to talk to you about the grid's readiness for these types of technologies. So is the grid ready for strategic electrification? Before I get into that, just one quick slide about VEIC. We're a lot like CEE. We cover implementation and consulting and policy, and we work in transportation and renewables and primarily in efficiency. And we've actually gotten a chance to work closely with CEE recently and are very excited about that, to have sort of kindred souls here. So we work all over the country. We do implementation in Vermont and DC and Ohio, where our offices are. And again, we're looking at electric and thermal buildings and transportation. So this question of is the grid ready is a question we find ourselves asking a lot in all of the different work that we do. And I would like to refine that some today to talk about where, when, and how is the grid ready for strategic electrification. And that level of visibility is really important as we're asking these questions, because we don't have a lot of simple yes or no answers. You know, the answer is, as always, it really depends, and it depends on where, when, and how. So the first place I like to start is looking at the bulk transmission system. So from looking at like a state or regional level, is the grid in that place ready for electrification? Can we accommodate these pieces? This is a graph of annual power consumption hourly for the state of Rhode Island. It starts with January here on the left and goes through toward December on the right. And the important part about this graph is looking at the peaks. So if we look at this really quickly, you'll see that the top 10% of hours takes that 20%, 26% of our infrastructure spending goes into accommodating those hours, those peak hours. And so there's a lot of space outside of those peak hours for new electrical loads. And it's important for us, as that infrastructure is recovered, the cost of that infrastructure is recovered on a per kilowatt hour sold basis. The more that we can kind of fill in those empty hours with consumption, the lower the rates might be. So we're looking at something, I think of this as a factory that's only running one shift, right? So when we look at the bulk system, there's a lot of room for electrification at the right time and place. So if we can make sure that we're electrifying and exacerbating those peaks, we'll be good. And I think this is a cold climate. It's similar to Minnesota. You'll have a similar load shape here. And so if we move down to the distribution system level in this next chart, it's not necessarily the case that there is ample space all the time for electrification. This map comes from a Vermont utility that did an analysis of their distribution systems to determine their capacity to host solar. So they were asking a different question, but they give similar answers in some cases. So you'll see the red circuits are areas where they didn't have capacity to host more solar without some infrastructure investment. The green they did have capacity, and the yellow down here is where they were approaching some infrastructure limits. And the principle here that applies to electrification is that you really need to ask the question, look into these distribution systems, because it's not a granular or gradual transition from, yes, we have lots of space, to no, we don't. You really need to look in there, and so we need to start investing in the technologies that allow us to look into those spaces. And also making sure that we're asking those questions at a time granular level. So we want to be able to see what that looks like today, what it looks like in the middle of winter, what it looks like in the summer, and start understanding how the different technologies perform at those times. We also want to know how electrification can help solve some of these issues, how it can actually make more space on the grid, particularly when we're thinking about things like solar. These next few slides are from a project that we did with some funding from the DOE, asking a question, can we get to 20% of our electricity from solar by 2025? And It was a pretty broad study. We answered these 3 questions, both with modeling and with stakeholder engagement around the modeling. And I won't go through all of that today, but we did ask this question of, can the grid handle it? We asked that of our utility stakeholders in particular. What do we need to do to make capacity for reaching not only this 20% electrification solar target, but also Vermont's really ambitious electrification and efficiency targets? And to give you an idea of that, this next graph actually looks a lot like one that Cheryl was showing earlier, but this is Vermont meeting those ambitious targets. Again, with lots of efficiency in that top bar, electrification coming in with the expansion of the blue bar that represents our electric consumption, and then a lot of our other fuels going down pretty dramatically by 2050. So we were asking, what does it take to get us there? Are we ready? And what do we need to do to get in that place? So one thing that we did was say, given our current load and our current stack of generation, where might the problems be? When are we hitting some of these either surplus or deficit issues with our power supply, and what types of technology do we invest in to get there? And so this is the results of some of that work. These are 5-day segments. The red is times when we have overgeneration, and the blue is times when we have undergeneration. And working with some distribution utilities, their initial response to this is, oh, okay, we can deal with that. We have the technology in place. We can deal with that. But then beyond that, we say, okay, how do we deal with it in a way that's inexpensive and a way that brings benefits to customers? And so that when we're looking at this January day, we have long times of deficits. Start thinking about how do we make some of these really steep deficits less steep. We can probably deal with storage and with demand response with some of these shorter ones, but these ones here will really stress our system. And what type of technology do we look at to sort of move those to the sides, or maybe sorry, I'm losing the word here, but stagger things like heat pumps coming on at the same time. So a lot of the technologies today we were talking about can deal with that. And if we look at the whole building level, sometimes zero energy homes are showing us this, not only the bulk system, but at a specific location, a building. So we see high PV generation on this early in the year, this runs from October to December. You'll see it might be net zero throughout the year, but it's not at a given instant. So how do we start to shape some of these technologies and their loads to fit what the grid can take? So when we're thinking about electric vehicles and heat pumps, we want to start thinking about what they'll do to that red and blue chart that we were looking at. And this is a study that NEEP came out with like last week. They just published about how the loads might shift over time. And you'll see that starting in 2015 to 2025, that's what the load looks like now. It looks a lot like that Rhode Island chart that we were looking at. And as we move towards electrifying heating and transportation, particularly in cold climates without a lot of gas, it's going to start to shift some. And so we want to start thinking about how these load shapes will map onto our existing grid infrastructure and some of the pieces that we have in place. So as we're doing that, we want to start thinking about how we make space for this on the grid, and this also gets back to something that Cheryl was discussing, and how we use grid infrastructure like advanced metering infrastructure to get at some of these questions around when and where electrification is and how it can fit into some of these openings that we have on the grid. Specifically looking at leveraging existing resources to mitigate the impact of these new technologies. So one example that we're really excited about that's being supported by the AMI data that we have in Vermont is looking at the value of energy efficiency to make space at the right time and place on the grid. So think about efficient refrigerators and light bulbs. right now, the goals in Vermont and in a lot of other places, kilowatt hour saved by a fridge is very similar to a kilowatt hour saved by an LED lighting program. But we know that that's not the case when we start thinking about making space on the grid. And so this next chart is really complicated, so please bear with me as I explain it. But there are some familiar parts. So the one on the left is, it helps us look at the efficiency performance of a refrigerator over a single day, and the one on the right looks at an LED light bulb. The purple line you'll recognize maybe as a duck curve, so that's what, that is the New England power demand, hourly demand over a day. And so at the peaks, the time up here, these are expensive power times. These are times where we're starting to drive the cost of our infrastructure in the grid. These are what the grid is built to. And the green line is the comparison between homes that have refrigerators and homes that do not. And so you really want, if we're looking at driving down costs and making room for electrification on the grid, you want your efficiency to perform well at this time of day. And you'll see here that fridges are pretty standard and about the same savings throughout the day. I have a theory about this little spike here that has it performing less well than a home, but we can talk about that later. And then this is an LED light bulb, and you'll actually see it performs, it drops the energy consumption right when we want it to at these expensive times of the day. So the more that we invest in grid infrastructure, like AMI data and monitoring, the more we'll be able to really emphasize these types of technologies and make space. That is true of efficiency programs. It's true of a couple other things that can make space, like weatherization, which can help heat pumps be more flexible. In there, you could turn on a, you can use them as demand response on a wider window if the shelves can keep their heat better, and biomass solutions are another good example of that, and I've been given the hook, sorry. So you also need to communicate the value, which can be in a couple different ways. You can send those signals of value through rate designs, you can do it through demand response initiatives, and you can also make sure you're writing these values into your RFPs if you're procuring new solutions, and you're being really specific once we have specific information about where we need the performance. You're not saying we need demand response all day, every day for a year, you're saying we need it at these times. So these are my 3 takeaway messages, and she's given me the hook a long time ago, so I can hop off, but we do have very specific recommendations here around policy and programs. The big takeaway being you need to think about these things from the very beginning and make sure that the value is communicated all the way through. So, thanks. Bye.
I think people can hear me, right? Actually, I'm going to invite all 3 speakers that just spoke back up to join me. It's not a solo show. I hope not. I'm not prepared for that. Excellent. Thanks, you guys. That was excellent. I'm not going to quite call it a cliffhanger, Kate, but I am curious about your theory on the spike around the refrigerators.
I think that's, so that happens at around 3:30 or 4.
Okay.
And I think that is kids being sort of like drawn to the shiny new refrigerator in their home when they get home from school, and like being around it a little bit more often, like opening it, or maybe there's like a new like a water or ice dispenser or something. Got it. So the thing with that data is it's pretty, there's low N right now. We're still kind of getting, we don't have a lot of data, pieces of data there, so a couple really curious kids can do that, I think.
Yes. Interesting sample set, perhaps. All right, so I'm curious, like, we're going to move into policies very shortly after us. We're going to start thinking more about the policy aspects, but we'll continue to do our best to think about technology and the user side of what the technologies we've been talking about. So kind of continue to wear your technology hats. And obviously, I think we brought up certainty, we brought up regulatory certainty a little bit earlier on. That's just one type of certainty that's really important for a business or regulated entity to move forward and make smart decisions. So technological certainty is another one, right? And so I kind of want to pose to all of you, how sort of certain are we that some of these technologies are mature, or how much more innovation is going to be happening for whether it's an EV or a charging infrastructure or for a water heater or an air source heat pump, all of the above, grid modernization technologies. So if you guys could speak a little bit about where you see kind of us in that maturity cycle, that would be, I think, really helpful. Ben, can I point to you first?
Sure.
Okay.
For heat pumps on the HVAC side, both water heating and space heating, I think the heat pump technology has grown, advanced a lot in the last 3, 4, 5 years. And there will still be probably improvements on the technology side, but they're starting to reach a peak, I think. I do think we'll see a lot of application growth in the next few years, so how it integrates with the house and the load will change, but I think the technology is pretty mature, and there are, a wide variety of systems on the market currently that are pretty well supported. So.
Okay, so increasing opportunities for contractors to be aware of these technologies, be educated.
Right.
Some of the integrating technologies also.
Yeah, so the technology itself is pretty mature, but sort of the application and how it actually grows in the market, I think, is an area that will drastically change in the next couple of years.
Okay, so just a few years.
Mm-hmm.
Ashley or Kate?
The technology there's the technology of electric vehicles themselves, and then there's the charging technology. And then in terms of like this comforting feeling of certainty, I think just living in this world, like the biggest thing I can be certain of is that there will be uncertainty. Like with the latest distraction and the latest technology can influence other technologies, right? Mm-hmm. But in terms of the actual vehicles themselves, the battery technology is something to look at, and the costs have gone down by over 40%. Mm-hmm. You've seen a lot in the news about standards coming out of the EPA. The automakers are 100%, okay, that's a very strong word. They're not 100% committed to it, but they are committed to it in terms of their investment in the technology of the vehicles themselves, both from the actual way that these operate with the chargers as well as how high powered they are. So the range, of course, everybody's concerned about range. The charging technology, right now we're at about 50 kW for fast charging. That will be level 2. Because you have cars like the Chevy Bolt that have longer range, that experience of charging will no longer feel like fast charging. So look for the technology growth on that. I'm seeing a lot of infrastructure that, this question of scalability and investing well is really important. So I'm seeing more technology on the charging infrastructure where you can scale it. So think of it in the sense that you have the dispenser that actually connects to the car with the connector, but then you have the power modules that are in a power cube essentially, to where you could start out with 50 kW, so you have that footprint. It'll be the same footprint, but then you just increase the power by adding more power modules, so that you're sort of like scaling up as the cars come into the market that can actually charge at that level. So then you'll hit a certain point, right, where like the cost of the battery and all of those things start to like stabilize to where it's not really cost effective to continue. So it's like, how much range do we actually need? Right. How do people drive? What's the behavioral part of that? To where we'll start to even out. But yeah, the battery technology, the charging technology, the software technology, which is where I live, is all there. But the way that we think about the convergence of policy and how do we translate those graphs into action, it's like the people aspect to it, I think, will continue to slow it down, speed it up, and kind of have that regularity there. So.
Yeah. And I think when you're looking at the grid technologies, we've heard from the utilities that they have the capability to deal with all of these issues. But that the technology is always changing. Some of the problems are changing, like the peak issues are getting worse and power quality issues are getting worse. So the technology is mature enough to deal with some of these issues now, and we're starting to see standards in place to make sure that you can kind of modularly update a lot of that. But it will be it's going to be changing quickly, and the cost of doing nothing is going to be increasing. So there's tension
Yeah, I
there.
have to look at both sides of that. Yeah. You started bringing up the maturity of the charging equipment. Can you just speak a little bit about the cost of charging equipment and trends you're seeing in that? I see a lot more discussion around the cars and the batteries. Can you say a little bit about the charging infrastructure of the chargers?
It was interesting because the actual cost to extend the power can really vary by site. And we tried so hard to make it a science, but even within, like, if you have an agreement with a large retailer, every one of their sites is going to be different because the cost comes down to how much you need to trench, how much conduit you need to lay, wire, whether it's, prevailing wages, those types of costs. But the actual cost of the charging equipment, so to give you an example, when I worked for the state of Oregon, we purchased 50 kW chargers from AeroVironment, and to be transparent about the cost, about $50,000 just for the charger itself. Those same types of chargers that actually have better technology and have dual charging capabilities, so you can not just charge one type of vehicle, there's different standards, are half that, so like around $24,000 to $25,000. So you're really seeing pretty dramatic cost drops, but the actual cost to extend the power just is so highly variable based on the site considerations and kind of like where you're looking at even. So like even within a parking lot, it could be a drastically different cost if you have to bore across the road, things like that. Yeah, we found cost savings like working with tribes. I worked with a lot of different tribes because they are their own utility and they have really generous power capabilities, and almost every time we had to add a 480 volt transformer when you're talking about fast charging and three-phase power and considerations like that. But from a per site perspective, from a fast charging, it's around $80,000, give or take, depending on how many ports, of course, that you're putting. But yeah, it's still definitely very costly. And when you're looking at where to put them, gas stations do tend to make the most sense in terms of where they're located and how they dispense fuel. So we tend to partner with Chevron and Shell, even though it seems weird. Like, we do have partnerships with some of those types of companies. So,
Right.
Yeah.
So opportunities for bringing down costs through other partnerships, but the technology itself is still dropping in cost and relatively rapidly.
Right.
So Ben kind of is people that both work in the energy efficiency space and really have an appreciation for helping individuals move from one technology to another technology, or to increase the assets that are in a building or home. So if we wanted in concept to electrify in space heating quickly, kind of like a moonshot approach, do you have sort of the lowest hanging fruit opportunities or some market segments that you would recommend hitting first, hard and fast?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think as I was saying earlier, that the people that have to heat with propane is an obvious case to start looking at, especially with sort of the high variability of propane costs and high use customers that have to refill sort of at the worst times in the middle of the winter when it's really expensive. They can get some really quick paybacks and some really, just for the customer, some big relief in terms of performance for the home. I was mentioning a little bit at the end of my talk that I think there are some other opportunities. Heat pumps are really cost competitive with nice high-end air conditioners. So in applications where a home might be considering a really good air conditioner, it's only a couple $100 more to switch to a heat pump. And then you get the added benefit of heating. Regardless of what other system you're using to heat, there's probably times during the year when it makes sense to use the heat pump as your heating source. So I think those two markets are probably places that you could start looking to make big inroads right now.
Right, so you'd just be able to essentially plug that technology into existing ductwork or whatever the house setup is, and run it at essentially twice the efficiency or more.
Yeah, so when you're in your shoulder seasons, when your heating equipment first turns on, when it's like 50 degrees outside, some of the heat pumps we measure, we're getting COPs of 4, so it's 3 or 4 times as efficient as whatever other technology you probably have in your house.
Right, okay, great. Moonshot approach, right? So Kate, I was thinking, we were chatting a little bit beforehand, but you guys are starting to do some on-the-ground work and demonstrating some of the readiness of the grid, but can you kind of dig into that a little bit more and talk about some of the demonstrated value of whether it's grid modernization or getting us ready to demonstrate some of the value that we're talking about a lot in like white paper space right now?
Yeah, it is a lot in the white paper, like the prep for laying the ground for pilot space. But we are we talked to utilities. Vermont got AMI very early. Some of us got it right around the era funding time, and we're talking to those utilities now, and they're saying that that AMI touches every part of their operations. So that eventually every piece of that gets reeled back to the customer, and it's reducing total utility costs. But very specifically, from a customer value perspective, we're able, as efficiency implementers, to talk to customers who work with, particularly with large customers. All of our custom projects are leveraging AMI to identify opportunities for savings, efficiency, equipment that might be misfunctioning or malfunctioning, and our general, even like looking at an HVAC unit, you can look at AMI and see how the weatherization of the home or the building can be improved. So we're seeing from an efficiency standpoint a lot of opportunity there too.
Right, so having that more granular data, even if it's not 5-minute data, but to be able to look at opportunities for efficiency, but also DERs.
Yeah, and so when a company is thinking about putting in some of these other technologies like electric heat, we can help them, using their AMI, we can help them control their loads to make sure that they're taking advantage of any rates that are offered that can, or avoiding any penalties that might come with adding new electric load to their systems.
So do you think it's fair to say we're kind of maybe rounding the corner from talking about this value and writing about it as a concept to testing it on the ground
Yes.
and really having
Yeah,
those findings?
absolutely.
Okay. That's exciting, right? I think it's very exciting. I was curious, actually, Ashley, is Greenlots focused at all on incorporating efficiency into the services it's providing? Talking about, whether it's identifying the more efficient operating cars or efficiency kind of at a systems level. Maybe it's the different tech software that you're providing in the messaging, or even the costs, passing on the costs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's baked into the DNA of Greenlots, and I think that's why we work so well with utilities, because we have the same efficiency considerations. Also, from the city perspective, like, we would love it if every city was just like LA, but cities have dwindling budgets, and thus efficiency both in cost and charging and integrating. So, for example, the city of LA is putting 500 EVs into their fleet, rather than looking at, well, we could just put these chargers at 5 different locations. Like, they had one that had a car wash where those cars need to come in, do their cars. We're looking at it from an overall systems perspective, but also with that software being able to really manage that load and get the most bang for your buck. And then we're working with SoCal Edison and other utilities across different territories on these types of DERs and all of these interesting things that are like acronym soup, but they're very integral to our operation, and that's why we promote utility involvement. Like, we're happy to be at the forefront, in this technology company, win awards, this and that, but we also are fine white labeling things too, because we firmly believe in utilities advancing electrification. It's got to have to be automakers, utilities, all of us. I'm also very excited about heat pumps, because yesterday we got a new heat pump installed, so I'm geeking out on everything he's talking about, but I can't wait to look at all of my data myself. But yeah, no, it's definitely very part of our mission. Yeah.
We have a data disease, don't we? Yes. And happy to have it.
I'm afflicted with it for sure.
Yeah. So even going to the point of having, are you looking at even the efficiency of the vehicles themselves? Like, some operating more efficiently than others because they have different heat pump technologies in them for heating. This is particularly relevant for us in a cold climate. Are you guys even looking at trying to educate the consumer about that more, or passing incentives?
Not to use a pun, but we all love our puns. We're a conduit between the utility and the consumer and the automaker, so we can reflect anything on our equipment. It's just more a matter of what that messaging is. And I worked at PlugShare for 2.5 years, and user experience is literally the foundation of PlugShare. And so we get that consumer feedback. But in terms of the actual vehicle, there are new standards that are being developed so that the vehicle itself could communicate with the charger. So the user does not need to use a card or an RFID or an app or anything. When the car pulls up, it knows exactly, well, first of all, it knows which charger to go to. Second of all, when the car pulls up, that particular vehicle, portfolio, that infrastructure recognizes that completely. So that is definitely the way that the future is moving. And again, it kind of like anonymizes things in a way, gives the consumer more flexibility. We're all busy, you know, it's like that careful consideration of how much information you need. So yeah, in the future, the cars will speak to the chargers. And then in the future, there will be wireless charging. It's a little bit further away, but that is a pathway that is moving forward.
All right, I know we're supposed to wrap up here, but I'm going to ask you each to take like 5 seconds maybe and answer this last question. But what are the major investments, maybe just pick one, that you see needing to happen in the next 5 to 10 years for your respective kind of topics that we've been talking about? If you had one.
Data collection and management, I think, both customer data and grid data.
Okay, thank you, Kate.
5 seconds.
5 seconds.
For me, it's just bringing down the cost to buy the cars, because yeah, all of this will go down in cost if it becomes more affordable and more people purchase the cars. And these types of jobs won't necessarily be necessary anymore. So.
Right, right.
I think it's really about, for heat pumps, about applications, both in terms of training contractors, but also in terms of kind of integrating the equipment and the packages to make sure they meet the needs of the homes.
All right. Thanks, you guys. Thanks so much. I'm just going to...
All right, welcome back, everyone. We were serious about not going anywhere and starting right away. My name is Jessica Burdett, and I'm with the Department of Commerce. I am one of the state energy office managers for energy efficiency assurance and operations, which includes oversight of the Conservation Improvement Program, as well as a number of our public sector efficiency and renewable energy programs and energy assurance activities. Again, thank you so much for joining us today for this topic. We had a really great discussion on the technology side of strategic electrification, and now we're going to move on to the policy side of the discussion and learn a little bit more from our presenters and from the panel what some of the policy implications and possibilities are for strategic electrification. As some of us, and it's great to see so many of you, I recognize like 99% of the faces in the audience, and it's exactly who I would expect to be here today, and so I'm very happy to see you. But as we've had, individually or as groups, many of these conversations, there's a lot of consideration to give for the economic benefits and the environmental benefits associated with electrification, but also a distinct need to understand the impacts to our generation, transmission, and distribution systems, as well as what it means for our built environment and what it means for our consumers. And as we evaluate how strategic electrification interfaces with some of our existing statewide policies, including the Renewable Electricity Standard, the Efficiency Resource Standard, we also have to understand and speak to the varied interests that we have in this state and balance those interests. And so I think we have a really great set of panelists today to discuss those different interests that have to be considered and balanced. So to start, we have Rick Murphy, who's the Managing Director with the Sustainable Growth American Gas Association. Mr. Murphy works with AGA's member companies to explore new business models and leadership strategies for natural gas utilities to deploy an evolving energy economy. Then we also have Commissioner Lipschultz, Dan Lipschultz, who's the Vice Chair of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. Commissioner Lipschultz was appointed to the Minnesota PUC by Governor Mark Dayton in 2014 and appointed Vice Chair in 2017. He is a member of the Minnesota State Bar Association and has served previously as the Chair of the Bar Association Public Utilities Law Section and Communications Law Section. And then, as we heard earlier today from Cheryl Carter, she'll revisit us on the panel, and we'll have some brief discussion together as panelists, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. I know many of you have been sitting there patiently waiting to ask many questions, so we'll open up for some discussion and engagement. But to start, I'd like to invite Rick Murphy to the stage to provide his perspective and presentation, and we'll go from there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, I'm the gas guy in the electrification discussion, the natural gas guy in the electrification discussion. And at first, I thought it was going to be one of those quizzes that little kids go through, is which one of these speakers is not like the other. But and I'm really pleased that Mike didn't refer to me as a skunk in the garden party. But I really am delighted to be here, and I appreciate the McKnight Foundation and CEE for reaching out to us. I think it's really important that we have a balanced discussion. When I look at the discussions that we've had thus far and the subjects that have been presented, I see a lot of common denominators, actually. I see the need for really making sure that we get this right, and ultimately, we want to make sure the implications to the consumer are balanced and meet their needs, whether it be energy affordability, energy reliability, or sustainability objectives. I think we all have the opportunity to find a way to get that right. When Mike reached out to me to speak about some work that we've been doing in this space, I mentioned that we were underway with a study that we engaged ICF International to help us with. And unfortunately, that study is not going to be complete until the middle of June. Nonetheless, Mike thought it would be helpful for me to at least share at a high level what our objective is with the study, and to be able to start the conversation and really have a robust discussion around that. We are working with ICF to really focus on the residential market and looking at the cost implications associated with what we refer to as forced electrification. If policies are dictating that we have to move the residential sector to electric because of specific objectives, primarily around achieving emissions reductions, we just need to make sure that we understand all of the implications, particularly with the cost to consumers. So let me just take a step back, just so for those that aren't familiar with the American Gas Association, I can tell you a little bit about what we do. We are the industry association for investor-owned natural gas distribution companies. So the natural gas value chain has three primary sectors. It's the exploration and production, the transmission pipeline system that brings the gas from the well sites to the market area, and then the natural gas distribution companies who actually take receipt of that natural gas from the interstate pipeline and deliver it to the 72 million homes and businesses that utilize that energy to meet their needs, whether it be comfort, competitive needs from an industrial standpoint. But our members are those companies who actually deliver the natural gas to the end-use customer. CenterPoint, XL Energy, Montana Utilities are those members in this area. So the concept of electrification, which I think has been clearly defined by now with the other panelists, which is the switching of fossil fuel end-use applications to alternative electro-technologies under the auspices of creating greenhouse gas reductions in the U.S. economy, has been around for a number of years, and the debate has been going on for a number of years, and it has escalated considerably, as you all well know, over the last couple of years. And a lot of this has been in the way of papers and studies that have been issued by environmental organizations like Charles Group, NRDC, energy efficiency groups. Even the U.S. government has issued papers along those areas. Based upon AGA's analysis of those studies, in our review of it, we believe that there is a need for more rigorous analysis, particularly around the cost implications associated with forced electrification policies. This includes not only the direct costs to consumers for the actual replacement of natural gas equipment to electro technologies, and the incremental operating costs, and those could vary across the country, But there's also the need to be taking a look at what is the incremental electric infrastructure that would be required to serve that incremental electric load. One particular area that we believe has not had enough attention in the analysis is the energy requirements associated with heating and water heating a home or business. This slide shows the peak monthly demand for electricity and natural gas during the period of 2014 to 2016. And looking at the residential sector, you can see that the peak monthly demand during the course of the year for natural gas actually is twice the amount of peak energy demand for electricity. Obviously, that gap actually becomes larger once you start looking at peak day requirements, and it can obviously vary depending upon the part of the country that you're in and the climate region. This is the national number, and I should mention that in our study, it is a national study that we're looking at, but we're also looking at it broken down into 9 regions across the country. And we are starting to see there's significant differences depending upon where you are. In some parts of the country, like in Minnesota or from Boston, where I'm from, that difference between the electric peak demand and the gas peak demand can be a factor of 3 to 4 times. So it's really critical that we really understand when we're moving these technologies, in the case of our study, when you're moving natural gas heat and water heating off of natural gas onto electricity, what are the implications on the amount of infrastructure that is needed in order to accommodate that incremental load? And Cheryl pointed out, obviously, we need to continue to drive energy efficiency, which will drive down that gap somewhat, but we really have to understand what that means. And once we identify the infrastructure, then we can certainly then start to price that out as to what the cost of that expansion would be, and ultimately how that would find its way to the consumer. I want to share just one additional factoid, if I could, regarding the peak day issue. So on January 1st of this year, we hit our peak demand record for natural gas. There was about 148 BCF of natural gas that was delivered across all sectors of the economy. When you look at the amount of energy, of natural gas that was delivered to the residential and commercial sector, it was about 80 BCF of natural gas. So what does that mean? What does 80 BCF mean as far as energy and the equivalent amount of energy? So if you look at converting 80 BCF during the course of a day into overall energy that can be actually created by the entire electric generating capacity in this country, it amounts to approximately 80 BCF. So displacing and moving natural gas to electricity on that peak day would have required about the doubling of the capacity that exists today. So since our study is focused on the residential market, I thought it would be worthwhile to take a little bit of a closer look at the residential market. And on this particular side of the slide, I'm not sure you can see the legends down there, but it shows the amount of heating systems across the country that are natural gas-based, electric-based, and propane and oil-based. So there are about almost 60 million homes today that utilize natural gas or space heating, and about 11 million propane and oil customers. The rest are served by the electric system. So a massive amount of homes that would need to be converted from natural gas to electricity. And then when you look at the size of the prize from the standpoint of the ability to achieve emissions reductions by making that switch, and Cheryl touched upon these numbers a little bit earlier, natural gas consumption in the residential market today accounts for 4% of our overall greenhouse gas emissions. 4%. So we would have to convert approximately 60 million natural gas heating systems to electricity and make sure the entire grid was served by renewable electricity in order to achieve that 4%. Obviously, that would be a massive undertaking and also would require significant costs from the consumer as well as for the electric industry. So a little bit more about what we're working with ICF to look at is we want to be able to answer a number of questions that, quite honestly, we don't know the answer to just yet. And we need to have this deep analysis to help us learn more about it and be able to be part of these types of discussions going forward, to have the discussion, have the debate. What is it in our analysis that doesn't seem right? Maybe our assumptions were a little bit different than what you would have expected us to use. We want to have that conversation. To date, we have not had the ability, partly because we have not had the data to share. So we're really excited that we're going to have at least a starting point to be able to get into the discussion and have an intelligent discussion about this. So we want to look at, will residential electrification actually reduce emissions? Obviously, that depends upon the makeup of the electric grid. And there will be, I'm certain that there will be parts of the country where it will make sense to electrify to achieve emissions reductions. I'm sure that will be the case. But is that going to be the case everywhere across the country, out for the foreseeable future? I don't think so, but we're hoping that we can be able to utilize the study to have that discussion. We also want to take a look at how will electrification actually impact residential natural gas customers that are using the fuel today. They are the ones that will be forced to actually convert, incur incremental expenses, and perhaps incur incremental operating expenses. We want to be able to identify what that may be. We also want to identify what are the impacts on the power sector as far as generation capacity, as well as transmission system impact and infrastructure that would be needed. It's not just on the power generation side. The study does not get into the needs and what are the requirements on the electric distribution system, because quite honestly, it was very difficult for us to get to that level of detail. And we don't have that as far as our scope for the project. And ultimately, when you bring all of this together, what is the overall cost of electrification, particularly as it relates to the consumer? Quickly, some of the metrics that are being developed as part of this study. We talked about what is the change in emissions that electrification could achieve through the electrification of the residential sector. Once you know what those emissions are and the generation that is associated with it, how much generation capacity would need to be built out, how much more transmission, ultimately what is the cost of that transmission, and then to have a couple of metrics. One is what is the cost to achieve for those emissions reductions. We'll have what the projected emissions reductions will be, but we'll also have the cost, and we'll be able to say, this is the cost of reducing a ton of CO2. How does that compare to other alternatives? And ultimately, we want to know what the cost on a per household basis will be for electrification. So I'd like to switch gears and talk a little bit about another piece of work that we're doing that is complementary to this or in parallel to this. And our members have said this is really critical for when we go out and start to communicate the results of our study. We need to be able to demonstrate an alternative pathway that utilizing natural gas that could help achieve some of those same objectives about emissions reductions while doing it in a very cost-effective manner and still achieving those sustainability objectives. So we are developing a pathway looking at what we need to do as an industry and our members, and it starts, as we've heard most of the day today, it starts with energy efficiency. And that's actually absolutely critical. That's a foundation from which we build on. The left-hand side shows the investment in energy efficiency that AGA's member companies have directed over the last 10 years or so, consistently going up with the expected budget of about $1.5 billion in 2017. And those investments have really demonstrated strong results. Obviously, there are more factors that contribute to the next slide, but what this slide demonstrates that since 1970, the growth of natural gas customers has increased by 70% from 1970 to 2016. That same period of time, natural gas demand has remained relatively flat. And that is directly attributable to all of the energy efficiency investments that have been made. We need to keep that trend going. We understand that, our members appreciate that, and we're looking forward to be able to do that. And the industry is committed to that. So in addition to energy efficiency, there are opportunities across the natural gas value chain for us to provide an alternative clean energy solution. And it's not only applies to the residential market, but the commercial, industrial, transportation market, and power generation market. And it's from one end of the value chain to the other. So it starts on the left-hand side by looking at opportunities to be able to decarbonize the gas molecule. And we're able to do that in a number of ways. Actually, Cheryl talked a little bit about the renewable natural gas opportunity, taking biogas from sewage treatment plants or agricultural waste or landfills and capturing that through anaerobic digestion and being able to treat it to the point where we can get into the quality that can be injected into the natural gas distribution system. There's also another technology, thermal gasification, that opens up a wide range of feedstocks that could be utilized to produce more renewable natural gas. Opportunities there to improve technology, to drive down cost, and increase the amount of energy that this could actually provide to the country. The bottom section, what's referred to as power to gas, I'm assuming you're somewhat familiar with that, but it's through the electrolysis process of taking excess renewable electricity, being able to convert it into a gas that can be injected into the natural gas distribution system. So on the supply side, we're looking at opportunities to advance technologies and get this stuff ready for market. Along the pipeline itself, the EPA Natural Gas Star program that has been utilized to modernize and secure our distribution system has enabled the industry, particularly the distribution sector of the industry, to reduce methane emissions by approximately 74% over the last 10 years or so. And that will continue, and that's an opportunity that we can continue to advance on. Moving into the end-use sector, technologies, we heard a lot about the electric heat pump. A lot of great research has been devoted to that. A lot of dollars have been directed to advancing that technology, and you can see the fruits of that labor. Not as much has been invested into some of the more emerging natural gas technologies, like the gas heat pump, that won't get to those COPs of 3, but could get to a COP of perhaps 1.5, which would represent about a 50% improvement in the energy consumption of a gas space heating system. In addition, there's distributed energy resources, combined heat and power, fuel cells that have been emerging for many years, but just haven't been able to get to that point where it can be fully commercialized and actually penetrate the market. But there are opportunities to do that. There are existing opportunities in the transportation market where natural gas has been able to help drive down emissions, primarily in the heavy-duty sector of that particular transportation sector. So there are opportunities, and it's incumbent upon us as an industry to make sure that we're advancing these. We make sure that we advance energy efficiency, make sure that we can take advantage of these opportunities to decarbonize the natural gas molecule while ensuring that our end-use technologies can get to that next leap. So I wish I could have given you more of the details around the study that we're working on with ICF. We do anticipate when that is released that we will be having a pretty wide outreach effort in that, hoping to get engaged in more of these types of discussions, whether it's through the efficiency environment or organizations like NARUC, NASIO, or other appropriate opportunities for us to have this discussion. So with that, I'll turn things over, back over to Jessica, who will introduce, or are we just going to bring up the commissioner? Yeah. Okay. And I'll look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you. I'll come back up, right?
I saw Mike do that earlier today. So you don't have to want to get it, but if you really want to, you can go ahead. I need to put my mic on here. There, now, can you hear me? First of all, thanks to CEE, to Chris and to Mike for inviting me to be part of this. This is my third CEE forum like this, and they've all been exceptional. Thanks to the McKnight Foundation for sponsoring this and for their leadership in the clean energy space that we're all sort of here discussing today. I've known Mike Bull for almost 25 years. And until today, I'd never heard that FBI story. And believe me, I've heard a lot about Mike that I'm not allowed to repeat. So I didn't hear that when I came here today. And Mike said, I'm wondering if I should tell that story before I start. And I said, what story? He said, well, you know, the FBI story. I said, what FBI story? He said, the one I told you at lunch today. I said, I wasn't at lunch with you today. And I wasn't. So I don't know what they did to you in that interrogation, Mike. But you've recovered pretty well, I guess. You know, what you really don't want is an email coming to you that to everybody that says, has anyone seen Mike Bull? Vladimir Putin's looking for you. Because the silver lining in that is you'd never have to worry about public speaking again. That would solve it. I'm here to talk about transportation electrification. And I'm going to do that in a minute from a regulatory perspective. But before I do, Tim, you're on.
What if everything ran on?
You're probably wondering why I showed that, and it's because I like it, and forums like this are an opportunity for me to see it again. But I think it also serves as a reminder that electrification has been with us for a long time as an integral part of our social and economic development. We all know that. And I think it also illustrates that compared to internal combustion fuel, it is certainly cleaner, it's quieter, and it's a lot less scary. Although I think a drill in your mouth powered by any fuel is scary, and certainly even an electric bus can kill you, but it has to hit you first. You can breathe freely and not worry about your health. And I think you ask why electrify the transportation system. And I think the answer is pretty clear. It is the single largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in this country and has been for at least several years now. And also, if you look ahead, it's only reduced carbon emissions between 2005 and 2015 by 7%. And a lot of that 7% reduction in the transportation sector's carbon reduction, a lot of that reduction has been attributable to, or was attributable to, the economic downturn or the recession. So they haven't even performed, that sector hasn't even performed that well. So the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, coming up well short of
the 15% goal for carbon reduction in this state for 2015. I think those two things tell you something has to happen in the transportation sector if we're ever going to meet the goals laid out in state law for carbon reduction statewide across all sectors. And as Mike pointed out earlier, the reduction between 2005 and 2015 in Minnesota was 4%. The good news, and the reason we're talking about transitioning to electricity, and everybody's talked about this already today, you haven't heard this fact yet, but the utility sector in Minnesota reduced carbon emissions in that same 10-year span by 17%. And you saw why, and you can see why. It's because of the changing mix of generation resources used to generate electricity, not just in Minnesota, but actually throughout the MISO footprint. This is in Minnesota, and you can see a 17% reduction in reliance on coal to generate electricity in Minnesota. And the good news, and the even better news, that makes the argument even more compelling to move transportation onto the electric grid is the accelerating pace of decarbonization in the electric sector in Minnesota. You can see here we're contemplating another 23% drop in coal's share of the electric mix or electric generation mix in Minnesota. And by the way, this isn't a projection, this is a plan. These statistics come right from approved integrated resource plans of Minnesota's investor-owned electric utilities. So if anything, the percentage of coal as a contributor to the energy generation mix will decline as technology develops each 2 years when a new plan, when utilities file their new updated resource plans. And I guess when you look at it, you probably ask yourself, well, is there any angle other than carbon reduction that would suggest it makes sense to electrify the transportation system? And the fact is, yes. The answer is yes. And I think what's really the beauty of electrifying transportation and why I think it's simpler than electrifying home heating and home water heating is that when you're talking about the need to have a strategic data-driven process before you engage in something, we have enough data to tell us it makes strategic sense to electrify the transportation system. And I think it actually meets the 4-point test, Mike, that you laid out before. Will it reduce carbon emissions? Absolutely, yes. That seems to be self-evident. But if it's not, you can look at a recent Great Plains Institute study which showed a substantial 60 to 95% carbon reduction simply by changing from internal combustion to electric for transportation. And does it increase the system peak? It's unlikely to increase the system peak significantly. You can see here that Minnesota retail electric sales have been relatively flat and actually declining, thanks in large part to all of the success with energy efficiency. And you look here, and this is great news, we have a really inefficient system. That's the best news of all. And what you can tell here is that the system operates at peak in a very, very small sliver of the hours in a year, which tells us we have a lot of headroom to add a lot of additional electric load without driving a lot more or significantly more electric infrastructure investment, which would drive up the cost. And the sum total of all this is that not only do you reduce carbon by transferring transportation from internal combustion to electric, but you actually can put downward pressure on rates, and that's already been alluded to, because you can generate more sales and then spread the costs of the system among more units of electric energy sold, thereby reducing rates for everyone, including folks who don't own EVs. And that's really good news. And so, yes, it reduces carbon. It's not going to increase system peak, or in all likelihood, it's not significantly going to increase system peak, which means it could actually have a downward impact on rates. But Cheryl, here you go, here's the good one, it's efficient. It's efficient, and probably the best measure of this, and I thought this is pretty cool, and that's why I think we do have data to drive this decision-making on the electrification of transportation. I've learned a new term, megajoule, as a unit of energy to try to kind of look across sectors to try to figure out what the relative cost and efficiency is of moving from one type of fuel to another. 120 megajoules as a unit of energy is equal to 1 gallon of gas, and it's also equal to 33.33 kilowatt hours of electricity. Well, you all know on 1 gallon of gas you can go about 25 miles. In my car, I have to be on the highway to do that. Some of you maybe can go 30, 35. For 33.33 kilowatt hours of electricity, you can go 114 miles. Is it efficient to switch from gasoline to electric in your transportation? Absolutely it is. We already have the data to tell us that. And so further essential reductions in carbon emissions, reducing upward pressure on rates, actually putting some downward pressure on rates, reducing transportation costs. And that's the final thing. Will consumers benefit from this? Well, again, the data's in. It's cheaper over time to own an electric vehicle than it is to own an internal combustion vehicle. It costs less to fuel your car with electricity, and maintenance costs associated with electric vehicles, as I think everybody here knows, are a lot lower than the costs of an internal combustion vehicle because there are fewer moving parts, no oil changes. So consumers benefit, lower costs, the system benefits, it's more efficient use of energy, and we reduce carbon in the process. I won't go any further. I'll leave it at that because I want to leave a lot of time for discussion, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion and questions from folks out there who I'm sure will have some good questions. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Hear me? I've switched mics. Is my mic on? Yeah. All right. Well, I'd like to invite the panelists to come join me up here. Thank you, Commissioner Lipschultz and Rick Murphy for your presentations, and then thank you for joining us. I'm going to kick us off with a question, but then I'm hoping as the panelists start answering this question, for those of you in the audience that have questions, we have a microphone that's up by this front pillar here. If you want to start lining up to answer your provocative questions about strategic electrification, we can start fielding those in just a moment. So given that this is a policy discussion, Minnesota has a long history of establishing clean energy policies. Like through the 2007 Next Generation Energy Act, we established the Renewable Electricity Production Standard, the Efficiency Resource Standard, as well as the Greenhouse Gas Emission Reduction Goal. We also have a number of policy tools at our disposal, whether it's resource planning or rate making or the Conservation Improvement Program. But for something like strategic electrification, what role do you see? Is there a need for something like what we did with the EERS and the RES to foster and facilitate strategic electrification? Or as we see technologies evolve and market forces evolve, do we have the market mechanisms in place to accomplish some of these objectives without policy directives? That was a compound question.
We'll give compound answer.
But I expect a compound answer, yes. So I think let's just start with you, Rick, and we can work our way through. What do you think?
Well, I would start by having a pause and making sure that we think about the law of unintended consequences when you don't have all of the information available to address a broad range of objectives. If it's singularly focused on one objective and there's a acceptance that this is going to have implications, that's one thing. But if we're going into this and thinking it's a policy that will address a broad range of objectives in a favorable manner, we need to make sure that we have all of the information and data available.
I actually think that Mike was moving in the right direction when he set out his four criteria, and there may be more, but I really think they're the basic ones. We need to start looking at this because of all the new technology developments and all the changes happening so fast. We tend to think more toward, is there an energy source or fuel source neutral way to compare all of the different alternatives that are out there, looking at the emission reduction potential, the efficiency, we can't forget the efficiency part of it, and I won't let you, and the cost. I think trying to, if where we can, rather than setting like an EERS for electrification, I think what we should do is set out our metrics and set a goal based on those metrics. Except in places where the technology is not as well developed, emerging technologies, I think there is still a role for technology-specific policies, and we shouldn't shy away from that. But I think getting the metrics right is going to be really important because we don't know what's going to be changing in the future and what new alternatives we're going to develop.
It depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to achieve more electrification of the transportation system, if you want to drive the scope and speed of EV adoption, I'm not sure what you can do from a policy standpoint. At some point, those vehicles have to be attractive to consumers, and consumers have to know and understand how attractive they are. And you can only do so much. Now, you can do more with public policy when you're talking about public utilities because of the regulatory control they're under. And you can look at utilities as a potentially potent platform for helping consumers understand the value of EVs, because every consumer, every potential EV buyer has a public utility serving them, and they have a relationship. And studies have shown that consumers put a high level of trust in their utilities. In fact, a recent study showed that when it comes to EVs, utilities are second only to Consumer Reports as a trusted source of information on electric vehicles. And so I think educating customers, and that's one of the two major barriers that have been identified, lack of education, could be a critical role for utilities to play. And I think as regulators and as policymakers, we either need to encourage them to do so or find barriers that might exist that are dissuading utilities from engaging more actively in that area. The other barrier, and there are really two huge ones, and the other one, in addition to lack of education, is infrastructure. And I think there are things that utilities can do and things policymakers can do to encourage utilities and remove barriers to utilities participating more in encouraging the deployment of charging infrastructure.
I don't see anybody lined up at the microphone. So I'm going to continue questions as those of you who may have questions. You'd have to go to the microphone.
They're lining up.
Okay, I'll make an exception for you. Nick, if you want to answer a question, ask a question, I can repeat it if nobody can hear you.
I'll try to talk loud enough. And my question is specifically for Rick.
Say who you are and who you're representing.
Sorry, Nick Mark with CenterPoint Energy. Rick, you mentioned, and I really appreciated, a willingness on the part of AGA and ICF to really sort of, once this study that you guys are working on is complete, to have conversations about it and let folks kick the tires and test assumptions and that kind of thing. And I think that's really important. I'm interested to know, when you look at some of the other studies that you referenced, are there particular ones that you felt had flawed assumptions and that were maybe part of the impetus for AGA and ICF to work together? Are there things that other folks seem to be missing and that's leading to their conclusions?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Is this too loud? Lower it down a bit. As I referred to in my talk, one of the things that stood out for us as we reviewed, I shared 6 of the sample reports, or many others, and they're somewhat similar, but there are a lot of variation in those studies. But the one that really caught our eye is this appreciation for the amount of energy that is used for space heating in homes and buildings. Is it fully understood, and the magnitude of the difference between heating a building versus cooling a building? And we know, because we see it from our members, the amount of energy on a peak day that is required and delivered through the natural gas distribution system to meet those consumer needs. And we didn't necessarily see it clearly represented in those other studies. And we haven't had the opportunity to dig into those studies with the authors or the organizations that issued them, and we would love to, but we wanted to be able to bring data to the table as well, that we could have more of that discussion. So, and we're hoping to do that. And we're very open when we say we want to be able to kick the tires and be able to talk about the assumptions and the projections that we've used in our study, because I'm sure we didn't nail it, but at least we can have the conversation.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, since our study is one of the studies that he showed up there. I do, and we also welcome and have been talking with AGA and other distribution natural gas companies. But our study actually did consider those factors. We used E3's model, which is a very, it's an economy-wide and a very complex model for the energy sector, but we're always willing to learn more, and one of the reasons why I couched all of my comments up there, and one of the reasons why we're pursuing metrics that can work across the energy sector is we are interested in finding out what the right answer is and making sure we don't lock ourselves into a wrong direction. As I mentioned before, 20 years ago we were opposing electrification programs, so that's not lost on us.
Great. Going to the audience, could you introduce yourself and who you represent, please?
Yeah, I'm Dominique Bozak, and I work for ICF, so thanks for all the shout-outs, guys. I am interested to hear, we heard, like, kind of the main two things we've heard about is electrification in HVAC, which is pretty well serviced cleanly by natural gas right now, and then transportation, which is kind of a consumer, like on an individual basis, making those choices. When I have known about electrification in the past, I've known a lot about it on like a commercial level of things like forklifts and riding cleaning equipment and things that use that like really kind of gross gas that produces like a lot of extra greenhouse gas emissions. So I was kind of surprised to see that missed in this, and I was wondering if you guys have any commentary on kind of where that's going and what that can provide for our reduction in greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, happy to start out on that one. We actually did look at it. I just didn't talk about the details in there, but that actually, if you look at the slice of potential for greenhouse gas emission reductions, it's not huge, but we think that it's really important because of where those emissions take place and what kind they are. So they often take place in areas that if there are people living in that area, they're usually disadvantaged or low-income communities, and it causes big public health problems for folks in those areas. So electrification of those technologies, there are technologies out there, as you mentioned, to actually fill that gap. And that's something that we should be pursuing. And it's also something that we think that utilities can also help with facilitating the infrastructure development on those as well. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's an important area.
Yeah, we haven't addressed it necessarily in our study, again, because it was focused on residential. However, it is an area that our members have looked at from the standpoint of most of them are run on propane, forklifts, for instance, and there is the opportunity to have compressed natural gas that could run those forklifts. And it's more around air quality and obviously potential cost savings, but really haven't looked at it from the standpoint of electrification.
Thank you. All right. Please introduce yourself and who you represent.
Yeah. Testing. Yeah. My name is Lee. I'm with the group I'm with is called Community Power, and I just noticed some that didn't really get talked about a whole lot. But I have a question about like how much or how many years of natural gas do we have left? Because I have seen like policymakers at the Capitol get so taken in by this industry message that there's 100 years left or 200 years left of natural gas, and then crafting energy policy as if it'll always be there, like till the end of time. But what if the supplies from the fracking wells deplete many years before then? And it's like I'm looking for some on how can we be prepared, just in case.
I'll take a stab.
That's for the gas guy.
Yeah, the odd gas
Squarely
guy.
for you, Rick.
So, just let's reflect back just 10 years ago when we were in an environment where we were talking about shortages of gas, high volatility of gas prices, emissions growth, and then because of primarily technology, that the shale gas revolution started. The ability to tap into reserves that have been known to be there for many, many years, but to be able to do that in a safe, in an affordable, and efficient manner was a complete game changer. So to your first question, and every 2 years there's a group of geologists that examine the resources that exist in this country for natural gas production. And for the last 8 years, their projections, even as natural gas demand growth year over year has grown, their projections for these reserves continue to increase. And the latest projections, based upon current natural demand levels, is that we have known reserves that could address existing natural gas demand for at least 110 years.
And I would just add that the question that we ask is not how much gas do we have left, but it's how much can we afford to continue burning in order to meet our 2050 carbon reduction goals without somehow capturing or decarbonizing it.
I was just going to say, in one way or another, we're going to be using natural gas, among other things, to generate electricity out into the foreseeable future, whether you want that to happen or not. Coal plants are retiring early, and that's by design and also a matter of economics. And you saw on the slide I showed that in 2030, we're looking at about 22% of Minnesota's electric energy coming from natural gas, which, by the way, is substantially smaller than the contribution of natural gas in electric generation in most states. And when you talk to states like Indiana, and I talked to a commissioner there, in Ohio, they're rapidly and surprisingly decreasing their reliance on coal over time. And they're going to be retiring coal plants early, but almost all of the transition from coal in those two states, for example, will be to natural gas. That's their way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which doesn't reduce them nearly to the extent it does in a state like Minnesota, where we go primarily from coal to renewables with some natural gas in the mix. Just so there better be enough there because it's going to be used.
Well, I think there's,
But will it come at the expense of water quality?
And those are the questions, and I think Cheryl made a good point. The question really probably isn't, is there enough or how long is it going to last, but how can we use it or should we use it, and how is it best used efficiently, especially when you look at it in comparison to other fuel sources. So you have to look at this, and I think CE has it right. You have to look at this strategically and analytically. You have to look at the data and make good decisions. And if it does not make sense to use natural gas economically or environmentally, and you have to do a cost-benefit analysis, then there ought to be other alternatives that should jump to the fore and used in lieu of natural gas. But if natural gas makes sense, for example, for long-haul transportation as a lower carbon alternative to petroleum, well, if that's environmentally sound and more cost-effective, then I would suggest, based on what we know today, that makes sense.
Thank you. So our timekeeper, this went by really quickly, is telling us that we have to move along. I do want to ask just one kind of final question and have each of you respond, and I'm going to take some liberties, just take as much time as you want. Sorry, timekeeper. You know, obviously this is a really exciting topic. You know, when we hear about the technologies, there's a lot of movement and development in technologies. There are a lot of unknowns that we're all, you know, in a world where we all crave certainty and like, you know, we're making big decisions around infrastructure and one certainty, but we also recognize there are a lot of unknowns at this point and there's a lot of movement. How do you, as you approach each of your positions and the work that you do and the role that you play in this, how are you balancing, you know, the craving for certainty, knowing that there are unknowns and knowing that things are moving really fast as you approach decision making and movement in this work? Start with you, Commissioner Lipschultz.
there are two fellow commissioners here, and as we all know, we operate in a world of uncertainty. Everything we do is uncertain. All of our regulation is based on forecasts. Whether it's in an integrated resource plan or in a rate case, we're forecasting, and forecasts are imprecise, and we don't know, first of all, whether the forecast is right to begin with, and then, of course, as things change over time, the assumptions that were reliable when you made the forecast, even if you got it right, are no longer reliable as you go forward. And so the way I look at it, it's nothing new, and I guess you can say that things are changing faster than they used to, but that doesn't change the approach, because the approach is you use the best information you have and you have to make forecasts. The real tension in utility regulation is you make long-term investment decisions on your generation, transmission, and distribution systems. And as technology changes fast, the obsolescence that has always been a risk becomes an even bigger risk. But you have to live with that because you have to make decisions and you have to plan over the long haul. And you may not end up with a perfect result, but again, the old adage, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and you live with it.
Cheryl, please. Yeah, I guess a slightly different version than living with it is we embrace it, and the policies that we try and pursue, and we're always looking for more, are really focused on no regrets and making sure that we have the right metrics, the right goals set, trying not to silo ourselves and get too focused on one technology or another, but making sure the incentives are set correctly, making sure the business models for utilities, for example, are developed and changed in such a way that gives them the incentive to pursue what makes sense in the long term and pursue the no regret strategies first, so we don't lock in long-term investments that we're going to regret later.
So I'm looking at it from the standpoint that there's been a tremendous amount of progress across the electric value chain to address efficiency, to address environmental issues, whether it be with the advancement in the cost reductions of renewable energy. We're seeing similar trends from a battery standpoint, energy storage, and all batteries aren't created equal, and the battery storage that we're talking about that we've made the most advancements with are not necessarily the technologies that are needed for electrification at the bulk level. We're talking about the need for seasonal storage, being able to have storage over 3, 4, 5-day period. And when I talk to the energy storage people, that technology they've only scratched the surface on that technology. But we have to believe that there will be advancements there. So, and then we have the end-use technologies that Ben talked about and the tremendous advancements. And from the gas standpoint, we have seen great advancements, as I mentioned, on the production end of the business, being able to tap into resources that expand the supply base, do it at a much more affordable level while addressing the issues of emissions. Natural gas has been a big contributor in this country for the reduction in emissions over the last 10 years. And the fact that we need to be able to continue to have advancements in technology, particularly to improve efficiency and improve the emissions benefits of natural gas. And whether that is the technology around biogas and getting more renewable natural gas, being able to get into the system, power-to-gas technologies that are at its infancy stage, or the end-use technologies that have been very close to commercialization but have not been able to get there yet. So it's an awful lot of balls up in the air for us to think about how do we play a role in a low-carbon future, and we think about that every day. And whether we're here for another 100 years or more will really depend on how we can meet those objectives for our consumers long term.
And one thing I wanted to react to something Cheryl said, she used the word, you embrace it, and we live with it, and then I realized I've been a regulator too long. Because we don't embrace anything. We live with it, we endure it, we tolerate it. And then you said no regrets, and we live with regrets. That's what we do. And I think that the point is, if we're going to make progress, we are going to make mistakes. And there will be regrets. And it's important to have a no regrets policy. In other words, try to avoid as many regrets as you can. Get it right as often as you can.
I said first, I didn't say only. I don't have that much optimism.
Now you're relating to a regulator on my terms. Thank you.
Risk mitigation. Well, this is obviously one of many conversations that we will all be having in the days and weeks and years to come on this particular topic. And I'm sure that McKnight and CEE and many of the other folks in this room will be organizing us again to further these conversations.